EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Jody Cohen of ProPublica, Illinois, and Jennifer Smith Richards of the Chicago Tribune teamed up to investigate the use of seclusion rooms in Illinois' public schools, often used to control misbehaving students, most of them with disabilities. In the process, they uncovered deeply troubling trends of misuse and overuse. Their reporting prompted not just outrage, but swift action by the state's lawmakers. We're going to talk about how they did the story and what they learned along the way. Jennifer, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me. I've been involved with EWA for a long time as a longtime education reporter. I'm excited.
And Jody, I'm very glad to have you here as well.
Thank you for having us.
Jody, for our listeners who might not be familiar with them, what is a seclusion room in a school, which is sometimes called a timeout space or a quiet room?
So a seclusion space or a quiet space is an area where a student is taken and the student cannot voluntarily leave. Their egress is not permitted.
Jennifer, the federal government doesn't set hard and fast rules on how schools can use seclusion rooms, even though they expect them to report how often that happens. What are the rules in Illinois?
Here in Illinois, there is pretty much one overriding rule, and that is that you can use seclusion, which we call isolated timeout, for the purposes of safety. And that's the only valid reason to put a student in a timeout or quiet or seclusion room.
But what you found, though, is these rooms were being used for a lot of other reasons.
That's right. We found through our investigation of looking at incident reports and information about 20,000 of these cases of isolated timeout in Illinois that the practice was being used for all sorts of reasons that had nothing to do with the physical safety of the student or the safety of those around the student. We found that schools were putting students in seclusion when they were disobedient, disrespectful, using verbally abusive language. And none of those are reasons in Illinois why you could put a student in seclusion.
Jennifer, you're at the Tribune. Jody's over at ProPublica now. You two knew each other, but how did this story get on your collective radars?
So I really like data. I work with data, and I had written about this issue before. And so when I came to the Tribune a few years ago, one of the things I did was look at the federal civil rights data collection data for Illinois to show how many seclusions and restraints were reported to the federal government. And I already knew that Illinois was regarded as protective for students in that there was a restraint and seclusion law, and it did have some restrictions. But the number I thought was surprisingly high given that. And so, Jody and I had coffee one day and I said, listen, I have this idea. I'm interested in this topic. I saw the numbers and they were surprising. Are you interested in trying to take this on and seeing if there's, a reporting path? She said yes, gratefully. And we decided to approach our editors at the same time if we could team up and collaborate.
Jody, could you have done this by yourself?
No, I think we needed to work together on this and have the collective resources of both newsrooms to pull off this project. It was labor intensive. It involved all types of skills, data skills, visual skills, interactive presentation, and just the labor to do it, to go through all of these reports and to compile this database of seclusion and restraint incidents. You needed people and you needed the skills, and having the two newsrooms work together made it possible.
So I think I counted 17 people credited on this project. I hope I didn't miss anybody, but we do want to give a shout out to one other reporter in particular, and that's one of the reporting fellows from ProPublica. Jody, tell us about her.
Lakadra Chavis was by our side the entire time. We were a 3-person reporting team from the beginning, and we, all did the work on this investigation.
Being in different newsrooms, how were you communicating as you were carrying out this reporting? Was there a lot of text messaging back and forth? How did you stay in touch?
Well, every method of communication we used. We were in constant communication. We often worked together at one of our newsrooms. We took reporting trips together throughout the state of Illinois. So we spent a lot of time in the car together, brainstorming, thinking about how we were going to write the stories, talking about the reporting. We communicated through text and Slack and email and phone calls, and we've talked to each other probably more than we talked to anybody else this whole entire year.
Jennifer, as the data person, you're looking at this big wash of numbers. I mean, how soon did you realize that you were probably onto something pretty big?
Oh gosh, I think that, in the very beginning, even before, any data was built and there was any data to put in a database, Jody and I put our heads together and said, how can we get these records? And, can we get these records, right? Even before we could conceive of the volume. And that first test FOIA that the two of us created and filed that came back with a lot of records, I think was the first hint that it was going to be voluminous. When we reached entering 10,000 incidents, we were blown away. We couldn't believe it. And then all of a sudden, it's like we were up to what now is, well over 20,000 incidents just of seclusion, plus the incidents that involved restraint on top of that.
Did you hit any roadblocks in any of those open records requests? And if so, Jen, how did you get around them?
Yeah, this has not been an easy road for FOIA here. Luckily, Jody's an expert, and we had a lot of meetings and a lot of getting together to try to iron out the language. But we certainly had school districts that denied records, saying that there was too much private student information involved in the records and they could not hand them over. We had a lot of that. We did engage our legal teams to try to get some of those records loose. Ultimately, the lawyer from ProPublica was able to help us get at least aggregate data so that we could represent districts that were actually using seclusion. We ran into roadblocks in every FOIA we filed, pretty much. We at some point filed a FOIA so that we could learn about the physical seclusion spaces. So we asked for floor plans and images if there were any. And we got back a lot of denials that said, we can't give you our school floor plans. We can't tell you where our seclusion rooms are. It would endanger the safety of the community.
I should point out that the reason we had to FOIA for those floor plans and images was because the schools refused to let us in to see the actual seclusion rooms. So we wanted to be able to describe them and see them as best we could. And that is why we filed the FOIA requests for floor plans and images.
That's a really good point, Jody. And that brings me to what, to me, is one of the most gripping pieces of this reporting and something I have never seen. And that is, you asked some of the children who had been secluded to draw what they could remember about those spaces. And these images are, I think, as powerful as any photograph. And I mean, certainly it's coming from that child's perspective. It reflects their individual experience. It's not to scale, but it says a lot about what they experienced in that space. How did that idea come about?
The idea came about during a brainstorm session. I can't remember exactly who came up with the idea, but we would have joint brainstorming sessions between the Tribune and ProPublica and our visual team and their visual team. And we did this very early on. So when we were going out to do the reporting, we already had this idea that someone had raised to see if the kids could draw what they remember of the rooms. And as you said, they're very powerful in their simplicity. It's, often just a box looking, a square, and there's a sad stick figure in that square box.
We're talking with Jennifer Smith Richards of the Chicago Tribune and Jody Cohen of ProPublica, Illinois, about their joint reporting on seclusion rooms in Illinois' public schools. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. I'm curious, Jen, you mentioned you had reported on this issue previously in Ohio. I'm wondering if you looked at any other prior reporting on restraint and seclusion. I'm thinking about a big project last year by the Oregon Public Broadcasting Organization, which teamed up with WAMU in Washington, D.C. And also there's been some coverage of the big GAO report, which came out last year, which found a lot of issues with how schools were and were not reporting these issues.
We obviously were aware of the NPR work and had seen lots of coverage about this topic. It's a big topic in a lot of states. There's been, for many years, a lot of debate about how to legislate and how to regulate the use of seclusion in schools. And so, yes, we absolutely, we're aware that there was other reporting out there. One of the things that we wanted to do that I think was questionable whether we could do it was get the incident by incident reports so that we could have a different kind of window where we're not just talking about the policy or the regulations or the rules, but we're talking about a day-by-day, incident-by-incident impact on kids and how they were treated in these rooms.
And certainly there is a focus in your reporting on individual children and their parents who very kindly and I would say bravely agreed to share their stories. Jody, how did you find some of these people?
We found them all kinds of ways through our reporting. What is really telling about them is, for the most part, in almost every case, they weren't seeking us. They were living their lives. They were bothered by what happened. Some of them had tried to go to officials, whether it was the police or Child and Protective Services in Illinois or other routes. And they felt like nobody was listening to them and nobody cared. And when we showed up, they were like, "What, you care about this?" And then they were so gracious with their time and the information that they shared. And, were just really open with us.
You also found some parents, I think, through an interesting route, which might be useful to reporters in other ways, and that's some of the public reviews and ratings that can be left online for schools. Tell us about that, Jody.
So some of the schools are, on Facebook or on Google, and families leave reviews about their former students, leave reviews with information, and finding families that way or through social media was definitely very helpful and something that we used.
I think it's changed in some ways how quickly you can find people, but also that there sometimes can be a paper trail that the school doesn't necessarily want you to see, and it's not one that can be FOIA'd.
Right. And it was not easy to find families. We're still hoping to hear from more families. We've heard from a ton of parents and families since the story ran, but it was a challenge and something that we worked really, really hard to make sure that the families' voices and the children's voices were heard in every way possible.
Jennifer, from the data standpoint, you reported in part of the project that there were some districts that reported to the federal government that they didn't seclude anyone during a particular given school year. And I imagine, was that zero a red flag for you as a data person?
It certainly is. And anyone who's read that GAO report also knows that zero doesn't really mean zero. So one of the things that we did was take a look at those districts that had reported zero seclusions and go into them and FOIA them at the state level and say, listen, do you actually have any records that would show seclusions? And, we find out that yes, in some cases, there were a lot, but had never reported an actual number to the federal government. And even, right now, as schools are reporting for the 17-18 school year, had not disclosed their broad and reaching use of seclusion.
I want to talk a little bit about the impact of this project, which has been substantial. It's pretty remarkable how fast lawmakers took action after your story was published.
It was the next day. So the story ran on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday late morning, the governor came out and said he found what was happening to be appalling, and he ordered the state to put an immediate ban on secluding students alone. And that happened, the next day. Another thing that happened was in Illinois, while there was this law that required schools to document every time they were using seclusion, there was no requirement that anybody actually read the reports. And not only that, there was no reporting of even data to the state. So the State Board of Education had no idea how often seclusion was being used in schools or in districts in Illinois. What the emergency rules that were filed the day after the story required is that within 48 hours of a student being put in timeout, which now cannot be alone, so it's a timeout with an adult, that has to be reported to the state. Not only that, but the schools are required to report their data from this school year and the 2 prior school years to the state by December 20th.
So you two have been reporters for decades. Jennifer, have you ever seen a response this quick to something you've worked on?
To have action come, in about 24 hours was really unusual. I don't remember ever having seen it before.
And I imagine that was also pretty gratifying.
Sure. We obviously, care about kids. We expose places where kids were being harmed and parents and students were really under a lot of trauma. We aren't advocating for any particular outcome in any story we do, but it's gratifying to see the state here take a look at this and say, you know what, we need to get a handle on this. We haven't been adequately monitoring this issue at all.
So I got to bring up the question that probably a lot of local reporters are listening right now and are thinking to themselves, okay, this is a massive, nearly year-long project. There were about 17 people involved. What can a solo education reporter do when looking at this topic? Let's talk about some concrete things they could tackle.
Jennifer and I are both education beat reporters. We both come from covering education for many, many years. I think any education reporter could file a Freedom of Information Act request to their district, the districts that in their area, the districts that they cover, and ask for all information about when students are secluded or restrained. Reporters should go read the laws in their state to see what is required of schools when seclusion and restraint are used. In Illinois, by reading the law, we could see, the documentation that schools had to fill out, and we were able to base our FOIA request on that. I would do a search of lawsuits in the area, although it's something that families, actually, they do not sue on this issue very often. But those are some initial steps.
Jennifer, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think Jody's right. Your first step should be understanding what the law is. And then second, what records have to be kept and what might you have access to. I think a good thing to do is reach out to advocates and special education lawyers who are in your area and just see what they're hearing. Sometimes those people have more of a handle on how big an issue is and may be able to kind of direct you to places that you should be looking or to things that might be available. And I would keep an eye, all of us as beat reporters, keep an eye on our school board minutes, keep an eye on what policies are coming out of the district, whether there are legal settlements related to special education, and just kind of watch what's coming through the board minutes that might be useful to you.
For anyone listening to the podcast who's interested in this topic and wants to reach out to us, we have gotten tips from around the country that we personally aren't going to be able to handle. They're not, in Illinois, and they're not in our region. So you can feel free to email us. And if we have any tips from your area, we can talk about sharing those.
That sounds like a great opportunity, Jody. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
If I can ask something a little bit more personal, this was a hard read. There are these handwritten notes from children who, I don't know how else to describe them. They're almost like notes from a hostage situation where they're pleading to get out. They're promising not to do something again, like tear up a piece of paper if somebody will just let them out of this room. And I imagine, that was painful for you reporting. And I'm wondering how you processed that and how you handle that as a reporter.
It was really, really hard to read those reports. And it never got easier, no matter how many we read. We definitely cried while reading them and were very disturbed. We talked with each other about it a lot, and it was difficult.
We spent a lot of time, frankly, kind of working it out with each other. So I would read something and either call or message Jody and say, I just read this really upsetting one. This is what it said. I think that talking about it helped and not having to do it alone helped. But there were so many moments where we read something that just was devastating. And we've been pretty open that we're human. And I know we're supposed to be dispassionate and sort of breeze through this stuff. But for a year, we've been reading these very disturbing records that are about real kids in our schools who are hurting. And we hurt along with them.
Jody Cohen of ProPublica Illinois and Jennifer Smith Richards of the Chicago Tribune, thank you very much for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.